Have you ever tripped while you're walking and had a friend nearby crack a joke along the lines of, walk much or just read about it? It's funny because when we're walking or when we're driving a car, we don't learn those things by reading about them. We learn those things by doing them. And yet, in other aspects of life, when it comes to learning, we don't practice, we instead just read about it. And so that's why oftentimes we can be frustrated because we've read all this information and consumed it all, but somehow it hasn't paid any dividends because it hasn't influenced how we behave. And influencing our future behavior, that to me is the point of learning. So learning is about influencing future behavior. Otherwise, what's the point if we're not going to change something about ourselves? And so if we know that, then we can step back and say, okay, these ways of learning, especially when it comes to on the job or in college, these ways of learning where we consume mass amounts of information, we read books, we watch videos, we're really just activating a mode of learning called recognition. So in a best case scenario, we're just going to recognize the material, especially when we read through it a second time. And that'll give us a false sense of mastery. It'll feel like we know all this information because it all sounds familiar, when in fact, we really don't know it because it's not influencing our behavior. And so we can read and read and read and ultimately just get frustrated because nothing changes about what we do. And that's because if we want to change what we do, we have to step back and ask ourselves, how do you go about changing your behavior? And then you need to incorporate that into your learning techniques. And that's where recollection comes in instead of recognition. So there's a difference between recognizing something, which is like having a multiple choice test where you have A, B, C, D, and you just have to pick the right answer. You can recognize the answer when it's there on the sheet of paper. Recollection, though, is much more like real life. It's like having a fill in the blank where you have to generate the answer yourself. So when we're learning, if we can engage recollection, that's much more likely to influence our future behavior. And so that's why when I'm teaching a subject, and it might be speaking about it or writing about it or an online course, I like to mix in some questions here and there because it engages a recollection mode. And almost all the time, those questions are fill in the blank because I want people to recall the answer. I don't want them to simply recognize the answer. And so in doing that, I'm hoping that people stop and think about the answer and come up with the answer. Because ultimately in doing that, the research shows when we try and answer something, when we try and answer a question, we strengthen the pathway to the answer to that question. So if you think about your brain as like a series of roads that go in every direction, when we're presented with a question, we're standing somewhere amidst all those roads. And we have to figure out how to go from where we are right now to the answer to that question. With recognition, it's kind of like the teacher takes you down that road. So you can read a book and the teacher kind of walks you from where you are down the road to some other place that you want to be, and then you have the answer. With recollection, on the other hand, it's like we have to figure out which road we need to go down. So the teacher doesn't give us the answer in that case. We're standing there, we see all these roads, like hundreds or thousands or millions of roads, so it's not a multiple choice question at that point. And we have to figure out where we have to go to get to the answer that we need. So if we distinguish these two types of learning, then we can focus more on this recognition approach and how we can get down the right roads to ultimately strengthen the pathway of those roads. That's the point. The more you go down one of these roads all on your own, the stronger that pathway becomes. You could think of the road as widening and getting easier for you to walk down in the future to get to the right answer. So asking questions is one way to do this. Another style of question I like to ask, instead of asking something I've already covered, which would be recollection, I like to ask something that I haven't covered yet. And this is a generative style of learning. So I might ask a question about driving, for example, if I was teaching somebody how to drive. I might have taught somebody how to put the turn signal on for the left arrow. A generative question would be, well, how do you turn on the right arrow then? That's really close to something that we've already done. So maybe it's a mix of recalling something and generating some learning. But it's something I haven't covered yet. And then maybe from there, I ask them how they can put their hazard lights on. So that's a completely separate button altogether, but because they've pushed a button or pushed a switch or something like that, they might know then to look for another button for the hazard lights. And in using generative learning, it's even more powerful if people get it right or even if they get it wrong, because they're on their own. It's not something I've covered yet. So the emotional reaction is much stronger. And we know from research that emotions, when they come into learning, really help strengthen those pathways. For example, can you think of something that you did 90 days ago? Like 90 days ago, what's something you did that day? And how did you feel about it, or what were you doing, and where were you at? Chances are, if you're going to answer that question, you have to get your calendar out, go figure out what day that was 90 days ago. You have to find out what you're doing and hope that you can kind of reverse engineer something that happened that day. It's not going to be very memorable. If, however, I ask you, what were you doing on 9/11? Where were you at? What did it feel like? Or how about President Obama's inauguration day? Or more recently, there's a bomb that went off in New York. Do you remember what you were doing on any of these days? Chances are you do remember something. I mean, I can remember something about each of these situations. On 9/11, I felt scared. I was in my dorm room. I had just woke up that day. It felt like something from another world was happening. It was a very powerful emotional response. So I remember to this day where I was at and what I felt. In fact, I remember many of the events that day as the events were unfolding. On President Obama's inauguration, as a flip side, instead of feeling scared, I felt a sense of joy. I choked up and I was crying that day. So I remember those things. Chances are, if you think back to emotional situations, you're going to recall the situation much better. And that's why generative learning is so powerful. When I bring the emotional response in from getting it right or wrong, so when you answer a question that I haven't taught you about yet, you will feel really good about it if you get it right. And even if you get it wrong, it's going to be a much more powerful wrong reaction than if it were multiple choice. So if you get it wrong, maybe it's a bad feeling, maybe you feel insecure or inadequate, but maybe you also just feel challenged. All of those are okay feelings to have because all of these emotional responses really strengthen those pathways and really enhance learning at the end of the day. And so that's why I like to use generative learning. Now, if we know that recollection is what we're ultimately trying to do to get to a point where we influence our future behavior, then there are things that the teacher doesn't have to do. The learner themselves can do. So when I'm reading a book and I'm trying to learn something new, I'll try to relate whatever it is to something I've done in the past. So not that long ago, I was changing how I ran my business. I was changing my pricing model from hourly billing to a fixed upfront value-based fee. And when I was learning about this, it was pretty scary because it's a whole bunch of new things to learn. So what I did along the way was kind of relate some of the new recommendations I was reading about back to past situations where I priced a project. I was thinking about hourly billing situations that just went awry. Or I was thinking about fixed price upfront situations that just went awry. Or I was thinking about things that went well. And I was trying to think, what would it be like under this new model? What would this part of the project be like? What would this part of the project be like? And then I use that to then start to triangulate what the future would look like. And I use that then to form pathways. You can imagine I have a whole series of pathways I'm familiar with over here with regard to hourly billing. And over here, you could imagine are some pathways that lead to some answers about fixed pricing up front and value-based pricing. You could imagine what I was doing was I was taking the pathways that I'm already confident with, I was walking at them, and then I was coming over to the new pathways that I want to learn. So I'm finding a path from what I already know to what I want to know. And that is really powerful as well. If you can relate something new to something you already know, you're creating a very strong connection to that new information. So that's one thing that I did. It was relating it to past experiences. The other thing you can do, and I do this at times as well, I'll just find a way to practice whatever it is that I want to learn. So in that case, I might actually go out and get a new project to be able to practice my new pricing model. Or maybe a better example, not that long ago, I was trying to learn how to write without revising everything like 50 times as I was going because it would just take forever to write an article. So what I do is I take subjects I'm very comfortable with that I've written articles about in the past before, and I would just sit down and write a new article about the subject and not allow myself to go back and revise. And then when I was done, I would kind of step back and reflect on the whole situation and see how I felt about it. So I was kind of practicing something that I had done before. Another thing you can do is practice something you've never done before. So like going out and getting new business or just flat out writing a brand new article I've never written about before. And that gives you some strengthening of the pathways as well there's a really strong emotional reaction when you do something new and you see the fruits of your labors. So that's another approach you can take. Ultimately, though, you want to apply what you're learning to new work, though, and new non-practice real work. So not writing an article that you're not going to publish, but writing an article that you will publish, or actually doing a new project with a new customer using a new pricing model. Because when you apply new work and you've done things a new way, you have a strong urge then in the future to do it that way again. And that's because as humans, we have this need to be consistent. Otherwise, if we're not consistent, we have these feelings inside of us that other people are going to judge us for being wishy-washy, not being able to figure out which way we want to do things. And we don't like it when we think other people are thinking negatively of us, when in fact, they're not even probably aware of what we're doing. But this is the way our mind works. So if you take advantage of that urge to be consistent, then doing it a new way once, twice, 3 times, believe me, that becomes second nature. Just like driving a car or walking are second nature for you. Which means you've gotten to the point you want to get to, which is influencing your future behavior versus where you were at when you began learning. So when you're learning, look for these opportunities to strengthen pathways, to put recollection to work, and to actually change your behavior, because that's what you're out to do at the end of the day. Don't simply just expose yourself to new information. That's not going to work.